Hello and welcome to the next video for my podcast for the glory of Byzantium. Now in this one I want to talk about the life of a particular Byzantine emperor, namely Romanus I Lekapenos, and this is his biography by Stephen Runciman. Stephen Runciman was a very prominent 20th century historian, very highly regarded in his own day and still today. He also wrote on the Crusades, and he really made his name at the start of his career with this very sort of interesting, well-researched biography of a relatively obscure Byzantine emperor, or at least obscure in the West. By the way, I should apologise for any noises in the background. There's some building work going on, so please ignore that. So who was Romanus I Lekapenos, you may be asking, and why was he so remarkable? Well, Romanus was the Byzantine emperor from 920 to 944, 24 years, which is a long time, especially when you consider that a lot of Byzantine emperors didn't tend to last very long, especially if they were usurpers, if they seized power by force and didn't really otherwise have any right to it. And that was certainly the case with Romanos. He usurped the throne in 920 from the rightful heir, who was Constantine VII. Constantine was only a child at the time, and what Romanos did was exploit the power vacuum within the empire, because the empire was being run by two regents at this point, one of whom was Constantine's mother, Zoe, known as Zoe of the Dark Eyes, or the Black Eyes. She was meant to be very beautiful with remarkable dark eyes. But however beautiful she was, she and her co-regents weren't very successful. They had lost a disastrous war against the Bulgarians, and their regime was very weak as a result, and Romanos exploited the divisions and the chaos within the empire to seize power for himself and become emperor. Which wasn't unusual. The history of the Byzantine Empire is really full of civil wars and revolts usually by army officers against emperors who were weak or perceived to be weak. And Romanos was hardly untypical. There were any number of usurpers who seized power. What was extraordinary about him was that he was more successful than most. As I said, he reigned for 24 years. And he was a very capable, successful emperor, which must have surprised everyone, because he really did come out of nowhere. He was about 50 years old when he became emperor, when he seized power. He had been a sailor. He had risen to the rank of drungarios, which basically meant admiral of the imperial fleet. So he must have been a very capable sailor and naval officer. He was apparently illiterate. He couldn't read or write. And we don't know a great deal of his background and of his life before this point. We know he was the son of a man with the truly unfortunate nickname of Theophylact the Unbearable. Now, Theophylact had been a soldier in the imperial guard, and he had actually rescued a previous emperor, Basil I, in battle. He had saved his life. So the family had risen to prominence because of this sort of act of heroism. But they were peasants. Romanus's family were very much drawn from the peasantry. They seem to have come from a place called, forgive me while I check my notes, Lekape, between Melitene and Samosata, which is now in eastern Turkey. It is thought that they were originally Armenian, although there isn't a great deal of evidence for this. We don't know the name of Romanus's mother, only his father. And as I say, not a great deal about him really until 920, when he suddenly burst onto the scene. And the circumstances of his succession to the throne were quite dramatic. he basically played this game of divide and rule, whereby he exploited the weakness of the empire and the regime of Zoe, the young emperor's mother, to seize power, and he did this by, well, you'd have to say it was treason, really. He allowed the imperial army to be left exposed against the Bulgarians when Romanos, as head of the fleet, was supposed to bring the navy up in support. Instead, he didn't do anything, and he let the army be attacked and defeated, which was a terrible act of treason against the state, really, against his own country. But it was all to a purpose, because once the army was defeated, that meant that Zoe's regime was even more unstable, and it fell soon afterwards. And Romanos was able to step in and seize power, and he does this very efficiently with the help of his friend, his great friend John Kerkuras, or Kurkuas, difficult name to pronounce. I'm writing a series of posts on Kerkuras at the moment. He was one of the great Byzantine generals, compared by Byzantine writers to the likes of the Emperor Trajan or Flavius Belisarius. He's considered to be up there with one of the great generals of the Byzantine or the Roman Empire. And Romanos very much relies upon Kerkuras. If Romanos is the brains, Kerkuras is the brawn, and between them they seize control of the empire. And Romanos has himself crowned emperor. And then he does something very unusual, because he now has control of the imperial family. They are entirely in his power, and that includes the rightful heir to the throne, Constantine VII, who is just a child still and completely vulnerable. He has no one to protect him. And the usual thing at this point would be for the heir to be done away with, or he'd be blinded and castrated and packed off to a monastery, or just murdered. I mean, that was the typical fate of the children of a defeated or a failed dynasty. The court politics in Byzantium was usually very ruthless, as it was pretty much everywhere else in the medieval world. But Romanos, very unusually and much to his credit, he refuses to lay a finger on Constantine. He doesn't harm him. He doesn't even remove him from the palace in Constantinople. He allows the boy to live there. And he lets him pursue his interests. Little Constantine, he was very interested in music and art and history, and he's allowed to do that. He's allowed to just sort of potter about at the palace and do what he wants. He's technically crowned co-emperor along with Romanos and Romanos's sons, although in practice Constantine is sort of shoved into the background and he doesn't have any effective power. But he's otherwise left untouched. And while he's a very sort of lonely child, he doesn't really have any friends. He's not allowed access to his mother, Zoe, who's been packed off to a convent. He's otherwise sort of left unharmed, and he lives a very strange existence, padding about the palace, painting and writing and amusing himself in any way he sees fit. And it seems that Romanos, although he had seized power very sort of ruthlessly, he did have a sort of a spark of conscience, and he wasn't prepared to lay a finger on the rightful heir to the throne, which was quite unusual, and it was also quite risky, because it meant that if there was any revolts or discontent in the empire, his enemies could always get hold of Constantine and hold him up as the rightful heir, as a figurehead, and use him against Romanos and his sons. But despite this potential threat, the emperor doesn't do anything. He does nothing to eliminate that risk, which implies that there was a touch of humanity to Romanos. He wasn't just your sort of average ruthless power grabber. And then for the next 24 years, as I said, he reigns very successfully, surprisingly successfully, considering that he was a man who had no obvious training in politics or government or administration. He'd been a sailor all of his career. He was illiterate, had no real learning. But he navigates some very sort of stormy politics, some very difficult moments very successfully. He inherits this very difficult war against the Bulgarians, which up until this point the Byzantines had been losing very badly. I mean, they'd lost one battle after another. And the Tsar of the Bulgars, Simeon, his ambition is to storm Constantinople, the capital of the empire, and make himself emperor, so he can then join Bulgaria to the Byzantine Empire and create this massive Bulgarian state with himself as the new sort of emperor. And he's won all the battles up until this point, and he's laying siege to Constantinople. But with Romanos, he encounters a very different sort of enemy, because Romanos has got no vainglorious sort of pride. He won't risk battles. He doesn't care about military glory. All he cares about is survival. And he knows perfectly well that Simeon cannot take Constantinople. He cannot overcome the defences of the city because they're so formidable. These are the ancient Roman walls of Theodosius, which are practically impossible to attack. And all he does is he sits inside Constantinople, and he lets the Bulgars ride around outside, plundering and burning towns and villages and making a great noise. And in the end, he says that he's willing to talk to Simeon and to negotiate. And the two actually meet. They have this very sort of edgy meeting on the Bosphorus, the waterway outside the city, in which Romanos basically says, look, you can sit outside Constantinople for years and years if you like, but we're fine. You know, we're content to wait until you lose patience or run out of food and go away. But the fact is, I'm the Roman emperor, or the Byzantine emperor, and you're not, and you're never going to be, because you can't take the city. And we both know you can't take the city, so what are you going to do about it? And Simeon has to acknowledge the reality of this, and he lifts the siege and withdraws and never comes back again. And the whole war, which, as I said, had been going extremely badly for the empire, it fizzles out into this sort of compromise. It ends in a marriage alliance in which Romanos marries off one of his daughters into the Bulgarian royal family. And soon afterwards, Bulgaria collapses into these sort of rival states. There's all these civil conflicts going on. Romanos quite cleverly plays his old game of divide and rule by sponsoring various Serbian or Bulgarian princes against each other, until they're too busy fighting each other to threaten the empire. And really, you would have to say he played a complete blinder. He inherited a very difficult situation, this war which the empire was on the brink of losing. They'd lost all the battles up until this point. And he turned it around with some very clever diplomacy. And this is a success. It's not very glorious, and nobody could pretend that the empire had sort of won the war. Really, it ended in a sort of negotiated surrender. But in the long run, Simeon, the Bulgarian Tsar, was unable to achieve his ambitions. And Romanos was actually quite sarcastic about it. At one point, he's informed that Simeon has started calling himself the Emperor of Rome, even though he hadn't taken Constantinople. And Romanos just turned around and said, oh well, he can call himself King of Jerusalem if he likes. He's not the Emperor of Rome. He hasn't got the city, I do, and that's all that matters. And he was quite correct. That was all that mattered. Whoever held the city was the emperor, and nothing else was of any significance. And Romanos sort of carries on in this vein, in this very pragmatic, sensible, steady vein. He employs his very talented friend John Kerkeras in the east, where the empire was engaged in another very difficult war against the Arabs. And for the first time in about 100 years, the empire manages to go on the offensive. The imperial army, instead of just defending its borders in the east, in Anatolia, what is now Turkey, it actually starts to expand again, because Kerkeras is very successful. He's not a very flashy general. He doesn't win lots of great battles like someone like Belisarius. What he does is he advances very slowly taking one city and one fortress after another over a period of sort of 20 years. And he's very patient, very cautious. He's very well supplied and supported by Romanus, who gives him everything he needs, all the soldiers, all the supplies. And by the end of this process, by the end of Romanus's reign, the imperial frontier has been expanded considerably all the way up into northern Syria, Mesopotamia, where it hadn't sort of really, no imperial soldier had set foot for over a century. Captured the great city of Melitene, among others, and had, as I said, had expanded quite considerably. And that was the achievement, the double achievement of John Kerkeras, who was the general who achieved this, and his master Romanos. Apart from this, there's also a war against the Rus, people from what is now Russia, who attempted to invade the empire and take Constantinople. People are always trying to take Constantinople. It's being attacked constantly. And this is defeated, even though the imperial fleet by this point is in a pretty poor state. Romanos manages to scramble together some ships and hold off the Rus fleet until his generals, including Kerkeras, always this man comes to help his master, comes rushing back from the east with the imperial army, and the Rus fleet and their land forces are slaughtered on the banks of the Bosphorus. Their ships are burnt by Greek fire, this famous weapon, the secret weapon that the Romans or the Byzantines always deploy when they're in trouble. The fleet is burnt, thousands of Rus warriors are drowned in the Bosphorus. And this is another victory for Romanos. He defeats the Rus. And so, after 24 years, Romanos has stabilised the empire, expanded its territory, increased its power, and really the empire is in very good condition, the best it has been for centuries. And it's thanks to the ability of this quite strange individual who comes out of nowhere, seizes power, holds it for 24 years, despite having, as I said, no obvious experience or training. He's a sort of elderly, illiterate sailor, but he's very competent, he's very intelligent, and he knows exactly what he's doing. And he's pragmatic. What strikes me about Romanos is that he had absolutely no delusions of grandeur. He would do whatever it took to win, and he didn't really sort of care how that was done, because all that mattered was the outcome. And he was absolutely right. Outcomes were everything. It didn't really matter how you got there. He understood that glory is a bit of an illusion, really, and only a fool chases it. Having said that, he doesn't manage to hold on to power forever. After a reign of 24 years, he's now in his mid-70s, a very old man by the standards of the time. He was deposed by his own sons, who were concerned that he was going to leave the crown to Constantine, who was still alive, still pottering about the palace. Romanus had let him be, kept him alive, and his sons were growing sort of anxious and a bit paranoid, thinking, well, why is their father allowing Constantine to live? And basically setting him up as a rival to us, because they thought that power, the crown, should have passed to one of them. So in order to avoid this, they take preemptive action and they seize their father while he's lying in bed one day in the palace, and they quietly carry him out of the palace. There's no drama, no violence. Romanos apparently doesn't put up any resistance, and they pack him off to the Prince's Islands, one of the islands close to Constantinople, where there's some monasteries, some sort of remote monasteries. And Romanos is forced to become a monk, resign the crown, and live there as a monk. He's not harmed, he's not blinded or castrated or anything like that. There's no need for anything like that. And he apparently was quite old by this point. He he was very guilty about the way he'd seized the throne, and he was actually quite happy to retire and become a monk. And he probably knew that his sons weren't really up to the task. They weren't very intelligent or capable, and they weren't going to hold on to power for very long. And indeed they don't, because what happens very soon afterwards is that Constantine suddenly turns out to be far more formidable than anyone had realised. Perhaps Romanos had realised that actually there was some potential in this boy. That's why he let him live. Because Constantine suddenly turns the tables on Romanus's sons, and he stages this palace coup. He arrests them both over dinner. He has them packed off to the Prince's Islands, where they're forced to become monks. And apparently Romanos greets them, and he has a good old laugh at their expense, and says, "Oh, welcome to your new life, boys. This is what you made me do, and now you're going to live like this for the rest of your lives. So, good luck with that." And Constantine becomes emperor after everything, after being put aside by Romanos. He actually turns the tables and seizes the purple, which was his right. He was the rightful heir, as I said. He's acclaimed by the people who love him, and he becomes Constantine VII and becomes emperor in his turn, and quite a successful one. He rules for the next 15 years. But that's another story. So that was a potted summary of the life and career of Romanus Lekapenos, one of the most peculiar emperors, I think, in a long line of peculiar emperors, and a very sort of underrated ruler, and deserves to be talked about a bit more, I think. So, once again, here is his biography by Stephen Runciman, one of the great 20th century medievalists, medieval historians. Highly recommended. And I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave some comments and subscribe if you like. And I'll hope to see you next time. Thank you.